Thank you. I'm going to start with a quote. Nobody actually reads the reports, but the numbers will be all over the internet by lunch. That's the goal anyway, end quote. So Jack, a director at Mercantile Minerals, was saying when he rode the elevator up to the office to start the day, the exploration flagship rare earth elements prospect in northern Quebec, Canada, would be posted online at 8 a.m., which is actually 4 hours after we get to the office. That past summer, Mercantile had paid drilling crews $12 million to extract core samples from sites spread across their 190 square kilometer claim area. Eleanor, Mercantile's chief geologist, had been on the phone for weeks from the company's headquarters in downtown Vancouver. Each morning, she had been enmeshed in conversations with consultants, auditors, and other geotechnical experts about the data that the company was acquiring to verify the total volume of ore that a future mine at the site might produce. Extrapolating sample results alongside then current REE market prices, which were quite inflated, and the cost of future mining operations, one consultant firm had estimated that the project's net present value would be around $2.3 billion, commensurate with the most lucrative rare earths mines on Earth. The resulting 219-page exploration field report, sort of thing you print it out and slam it on a table, it makes a big noise. The company's biggest press release of the year was replete with painstaking explanations of the company's drilling procedures and the analytical processes used to estimate future production volumes and profits. As Jack and Mercantile's team of investor relations specialists spent the morning phoning hundreds of contacts to announce the report's release, though, many in the office wondered aloud if it was more data that investors were looking for. By lunchtime, the phones were quiet. Jack had retreated to his office overlooking Howe Street, the epicenter and kind of like the eponym of Vancouver's mineral exploration industry and finance industry. And Jack was busily trawling the internet. Like many of the potential investors that Mercantile staff had called that morning, though, Jack was not looking for more data, but for stories. Over the past 3 years, it had become something of a tradition. After each press release, Jack would seek out blog posts about developments at other mineral exploration sites, technology news items, and other narratives to post to the Rare Earth Elements discussion group, an invitation-only list that he created on the social networking site LinkedIn in 2010 and had moderated since. With over 6,000 members, the group was and remains the largest single online discussion venue devoted to rare earth industry news and gossip, logging in from corporate and government offices, and for the many, many self-employed prospectors in the group, their own homes. Geologists, prospective investors, and so-called technology pundits and other group members discussed stock prices for dozens of different rare earths exploration ventures. And just to back up for a moment, the term rare earth sometimes gets applied to lots of different specialty minerals, but the term is only formally applicable to these brown items down here, the ones with very long, complicated names that if you were in a chemistry class as an undergraduate and were told that you need to memorize the periodic table, they could usually say, you can skip these. You can't skip these anymore, apparently. So it's the 15 elements of the lanthanide series, as well as the elements yttrium and scandium. So these folks, they shared links to articles about international mining policies, emergent technologies, celebrated designs that utilized rare earth-based materials or advancements in chemical processing techniques that might open pathways to previously inaccessible ores. Several times a month, forum discussions drifted into more, let's say, fantastical topics, from theories about international trade conspiracies to the possibility of mining on the moon. And there's actually a lot of conversation on this latter topic. A political geographer named Julie Klinger has a really excellent book about it. But anyway, Jack often joked with Eleanor and other Mercantile staff about the ease with which forum posters associated such speculative fictions, actors category, his words, as he called them, with reports from Mercantile's Nunavik deposit and other so-called serious projects, speculative fictions, serious projects. But as Mercantile's stock price hovered at 15 cents a share, down almost 99% from the previous summer, Jack was learning to leave some of these fantasies intact. So like many people working for mineral exploration firms, Jack navigated different genres of documentation and discussion with the goal of differentiating Mercantile's approach to its project from the destructive speculation for which the Canadian mineral exploration industry has long been infamous. This distinction, like the elusive one between benign and malevolent speculation that sociologist Alex Preda locates at the heart of contemporary capitalism, has become an especially crucial one on the TSXV, an electronic venture exchange listing more mineral exploration companies than any other exchange in the world. Opened by the Toronto Stock Exchange in 1999 as a replacement for the Vancouver Stock Exchange and several other regional Canadian exchanges, The TSXV presents itself as a sophisticated yet accessible market, one that painstakingly regulates its issuers, even as it offers small-scale investors the excitement of high-risk ventures. Basically, think Wolf of Wall Street, but lots of denim. So all exploration companies listed on the exchange are governed by meticulous rules for disclosing and auditing data related to their geotechnical work. So again, the kind of analyses that geologists perform to figure out like how much of a given element is in a given piece of rock. Some companies have embraced these processes and treated third-party technical reports on their prospects as key promotional materials. This is not something they necessarily hide. In recent years, though, fluctuating commodity prices and an increasingly complex regulatory regime has meant that most exploration companies active in North America require a decade or more to prove up prospective deposits into producing mines. So promoters of serious projects, Jack and others lament, are finding it harder and harder to hold the interest of restless investors. So Jack's dilemma exemplifies a challenge facing thousands of experts whose working lives have become enmeshed in the promissory logics, disclosure procedures, and aura surrounding capital markets. New kinds of venture exchanges and new auditing regimes governing the thousands of mineral exploration companies issuing shares on these exchanges have dramatically altered the temporalities of global resource development. They've also changed how different market actors conceptualize the ethics and efficacies of so-called speculative practices, which in turn have altered the ways that courts assign liabilities for the uncertain knowledge produced through exploratory work. Someone needs to get sued if this falls apart, right? Rather than generating trust among many different kinds of market actors, though, these processes have magnified what many market analysts describe as an intractable sense of crisis. For a brief period, rare earths exploration ventures had seemed to promise promoters new terms for assuaging investors' impatience. In 2010, hundreds of new rare earths-focused exploration companies were brought into existence, essentially all at once, by a dramatic surge in prices for rare earths-based materials caused initially by the imposition of new export quotas on rare earths exports from China, which is still essentially the only major producer of rare earths when I began visiting Mercantile's office in 2012. And other than one mine in Northern Australia, is still really the only major producer on Earth. Promotional campaigns for these companies highlighted the crucial roles that these materials played in the construction of electric car batteries, smartphone chips, and other sophisticated technologies, and presented the search for North American rare earths deposits as a moral and patriotic duty, basically anti-NIMBYism. So like Mercantile, nearly all of these companies were juniors, small companies often comprising fewer than half a dozen geologists and promoters that hire temporary crews for on-the-ground exploration work and advertise their findings to small-scale investors, partnering firms, and eventually to the production companies or majors that develop an infinitesimally small number of these sites into actual mines. The factoid that was often thrown at me was about 1 out of every maybe 4,000 exploration sites actually becomes a mine. So few juniors own any assets beyond their claim titles and the mineralogical data obtained through their work. But for most, these data and claims are enough to secure listings on the TSXV. During recent market spikes for cobalt, lithium, and other specialized minerals, several juniors sold claims to producers, again, just claims, not things that didn't necessarily develop into anything, for hundreds of millions of dollars. Hundreds of others made profits by selling shares for nascent projects where substantial exploration work had yet to take place. The 2012 rare earths crash had few obvious winners. However, months after dozens of juniors saw their stock prices increase 100-fold, nearly all were trading again for pennies per share. So to many commentators I met, this collapse was simply the end of a bubble. It was predicted, right? The likes of which had affected countless other juniors since the 19th century. Some exploration geologists and other market actors, though, were reluctant to dismiss this investment activity that preceded the collapse as mere speculation. Even after junior stock prices declined dramatically from 2012 onward, TSXV officials continue to hail the rare earths exploration industry as a model for a new kind of venture capitalism. For those who invested early and wisely, they insisted, rare earths projects promised far greater potential value than prospects for conventional commodities whose markets and applications were already well understood. The rapid pace of rare earths-based technology development meant that prospective investors would stand to benefit from disruptive innovations across a range of emergent industries, these experts insisted. This is the same kind of like move fast and break things ethos. Essentially, it's been made famous by Silicon Valley startup companies and their associated bros. So the vague and open-ended nature of these assurances caused information about rare earths prospects to circulate in unruly ways. And this is essentially the kind of main focus of my talk today. Thanks to the incredible complexity of rare earths mineralogy, non-specialist market participants were often heavily dependent on expert interpretation for understanding the feasibility and possible evolution of rare earths metallurgical processing and materials design. Meanwhile, though, these same technical complexities and indeterminacies had also greatly increased the popularity of newsletters, blogs, and other online discussion spaces run by non-specialists, which together frequently help to keep apocryphal information in circulation as well. Right? So for mercantile staff, federating flows of information and enthusiasm had long ago become a full-time task. During my time with the company, I observed how Jack, Eleanor, and their colleagues tacitly facilitated comparisons between vetted prospects and apparent fantasies, particularly within discussion threads attached to the tutorials, like this one, that Jack organized to help other LinkedIn members parse rare earths-related technical subjects. They really saw themselves as performing a pedagogical function. Right? But by presenting links to serious discussions of exploration science and finance, side by side with sensational conjectures, mercantile staff nevertheless helped to enact an imaginative space in which the tedious and time-consuming work of filing disclosures, auditing technical reports, and proving up prospects into producing mines had essentially all but disappeared. Right? They're working on time. So in deferring their own epistemic authority in order to retain the attention of restless investors, though, these same experts also expose what I really think, and this is basically the argument here, these same experts also exposed an irreducible tension underlying contemporary venture capitalism, right, which is despite bearing legal responsibility for the accuracy of geotechnical analyses upon which the legitimacy of the TSXV had come to depend, these same staff had also resigned themselves to the fact that ailing Canadian venture markets needed new stories to keep them alive. So the ethical weight attributed to these communication practices has a complex history in Canada. For nearly a century, processes of disclosure, which is essentially the regulated reportage of a firm's transactions and analytical activities, has played a central role in building and legitimating Canadian markets. And a lot of people have written about similar things in the United States, Japan, and other places. But as new kinds of venture capital exchanges and new commodities with amorphous technological horizons have emerged in the 21st century, the roles that individual experts play in legitimizing these markets has grown more complex. As I'll describe later, the Canadian Securities Administrators, the CSA, imposed new technical disclosure requirements in 1999 after revelations of fraud at a gold prospect in Indonesia left thousands of shareholders with spectacular losses. And just to be clear, this is not really a Canadian story because, like in Australia, Canadian mining companies and Australian mining companies, they are the global mining companies. Right? They're multinational, but they're really based in Perth and in Vancouver. That's the exploration industry worldwide. So more recently, other federal and provincial governing bodies have also introduced tax incentives for venture stock purchases and funded media campaigns championing mineral prospecting as the new bedrock of Canada's economy. Right. So basically, there's a whole lot of emphasis on promoting by government agencies on promoting venture finance as not just viable, but as something that can sustain other kinds of financial infrastructures. So even as regulatory institutions prescribe ever more laborious measures for certifying technical knowledge, in other words, these same institutions' prevailing interest in keeping venture capitalism in motion has rendered individual experts tacitly responsible for enabling unregulated arenas of discussion to proliferate, arenas where prospective investors might form affective attachments to serious projects by engaging in speculative comparisons. In recent years, anthropologists and other scholars have used the term speculation to identify like an array of settings and processes whereby people's efforts to make claims on uncertain futures affect their lives in the present. Whether in spaces of finance or works of literary fiction, thinking about someone like Kyle Powys White, who looks at this in the context of indigenous climate change of science fiction, speculative practices have material causes and effects. Woven into processes of commodification and exchange, speculation can also refashion how individuals experience the physical world. As Laura Baer puts it, for instance, material forms such as infrastructures, land, housing, oil, and gold, they have their own qualities of durability and responsiveness to the labor of speculation. Speculation is something that you do, right? They're unfolded into, pressed back against, or eroded and made fragile through the circulation of capital and financial instruments, or in this case, the circulation of stories. But as Baer and others show, many efforts to regulate speculative practices effectively disavow these relational and material entanglements by locating speculation in the individual imagination. That's really the problem that I'm trying to address here. So what eventually comes to count as unethical speculation or fraud, which is what all of this apparatus is set up to police in the first place, is rarely distinguishable by a dearth of documents or materially grounded calculative practices. When speculative practices precipitate market failures or other events that come to be regarded as collective crises, regulatory institutions, though, they invariably respond by redefining speculation as an imaginative practice and by treating the authors of the documents involved in these processes as subjects to be viewed with mistrust. So depending on how they circulate and what kinds of authorial roles they make legible, the specific kinds of documents and narratives that emerge during crisis might be understood as both causes and consequences of crises themselves. In their book, The Leviathan and the Air Pump, for instance, historians of science Stephen Chapin and Simon Schaffer famously argue that the emergence of the experimental report was intimately shaped by natural philosophers' anxiety surrounding the English Civil War and Restoration in the 17th century. Early modern experimentalists, they show, decried logical argumentation for according too much authority to artful rhetoric. Physical demonstrations, meanwhile, were prized amongst these same folks because they could be dispassionately recounted through pictures, procedural notes, and detailed firsthand accounts, which could then facilitate the virtual witnessing of the same experiment by theoretically independent publics. Right, so what we're essentially talking about is a structure of legitimation. The genre conventions and mechanisms of circulation that shape the production and reception of these artifacts, Stephen Chapin argues elsewhere, quote, dramatize the social relations proper to a community of experimental philosophers. So there's a kind of ethics at stake here. Taken together, these artifacts and their attending norms served early modern experts as literary technologies for certifying bodies of knowledge, extending and reinforcing the authority of scientists, and ultimately resolving crises of trust. During my months, it wasn't actually that many months, at Mercantile headquarters, I routinely heard staff describe the prolonged doldrums affecting the TSXV as what they called the result of a trust gap between investors and industry experts, not just financiers, but also geologists. Many of these same experts, however, also bemoaned the regulatory measures introduced to remedy this gap for misrecognizing how specific technical documents enabled them to craft relationships with other market actors. So these documents, much like the relationships that Mercantile's experts sought to cultivate with other actors, were diverse, ranging from highly publicized geological assessments, online project updates, and advertisements to the more kind of mundane realm of interoffice emails and regulatory filings. Each of the literary technologies relevant to Mercantile's exploration work combine numbers, images, and narratives designed to, in ways to convey the Nunavut deposit as simultaneously exciting and accessible. And I can talk more specifically about how these things work in the Q&A if you like. Every day, I observed company representatives deploy different artifacts to engage with specific audiences, corporate sponsors, government regulators, geotechnical consulting experts, and staff from other rare earths-focused exploration companies, Eleanor explained to me, quote, all wanted to study up on their own terms, end quote. For Mercantile staff charged with weaving the technical details of project updates and reflections on market trends into their daily communications with shareholders, though, each artifact also mobilized different terms for differentiating between speculation and serious investment and for conveying faith in the TSXV as a whole. So it isn't just mineral exploration experts who are struggling with these kinds of changes. In recent years, ethnographers have identified a broad range of material artifacts and communicative practices that facilitate specific configurations of trust within markets. Many scholars have also devoted increasing attention to subtle differences between market actors' disciplinary backgrounds and their professional roles within their respective institutions. So whether you're talking about analysts, traders, economists, policymakers, auditors, and other actors, they each have a different way of conceptualizing how their expertise relates to a broader moral authority amongst their colleagues and the world at large. So it's not just about legitimating expertise. Like the terms through which this plays out and like what expertise means changes quite a bit depending on these kinds of affiliations. But still, recent historical shifts have made these experiences especially fraught in the mining industry. As I'll describe in a moment, government efforts to demarcate proper and improper speculation in venture capital markets has caused new documentary procedures to proliferate throughout the spaces where I worked. But even as the industry as a whole has transitioned towards more formalized processes of auditing and certification, the figure of the individual expert as a moral agent in the kind of, I don't want to say simplistic, but the fundamental sense that Chapin and Schaefer described 35 years ago really remains intact for these regulators. So the figure of the individual expert as a moral agent, it's only more important now to state efforts to present venture finance as a governable space. Each of the technical artifacts introduced or resignified through these processes provide experts with new affordances for mediating other individuals' engagements with markets. But many artifacts are coordinated around simple narrative descriptions of possible future events, and then subsequently help to reify the economy writ large, right? So we're moving between scales quite rapidly within the span of individual interactions, whether it's at something like a mining industry conference or a phone call between an investor relations specialist and a prospective investor. At the same time, other kinds of narratives can carry different affordances, from the semi-conspiratorial fantasies shared on LinkedIn to detailed counterfactuals assembled for things like carbon offsets and other elusive commodities. Right? So the sheer diversity of these literary technologies raises additional questions. There isn't just one literary technology that wins out, one that kind of legitimates the space and the people who are populating. Unlike Canadian regulators, exploration geologists and other industry professionals rarely ascribe shareholders' faith in specific companies or broader market trends to their ability to identify specific trustworthy individuals. To put it slightly differently, the people that I work with don't think that trust works like this. They don't think that you need to be able to identify someone specific that you can sue in order to trust the system, which is kind of how anthropologists think about these sorts of things. Describing efforts to engender trust and liability in other techno-scientific contexts, some scholars have argued for depersonalized frameworks of trust in contexts where either an overabundance or a lack of technical planning capacity causes their interlocutors to view interdependence in depersonalized or enunciatory terms, to borrow a phrase from the anthropologist Kim Forge. So explaining how computer scientists eventually came to trust the work of automated code checking algorithms, for instance, sociologist Donald Mackenzie explicitly challenges Chapin's assertion that the identification of trustworthy agents is necessary to the constitution of any body of knowledge by showing how machines can come to mediate ethical ties among experts. To the experts charged with building and maintaining technoscientific systems, then, the persistence of liability systems focused exclusively on specific individuals may serve as evidence that regulatory officials are either unable or unwilling to understand how experts' communication practices and technical analyses come to be woven into their actual relationships with the people they engage with their work, right? Or as the geologists sometimes ask me, do these policymakers actually want these markets to continue to function if they're designing these regulatory measures in this way? So these regulators, they continue to insist that active and functioning exchanges will emerge from the coordination of formalized documents and trustworthy experts. Basically, they've read Leviathan and the Air Pump, and they've said, this is how it works, we're going to design this. But as more experts embedded within financial markets find themselves responsible for federating flows of serious and speculative information and mediating uncertainties at multiple scales, from the accuracy of specific geological assessments, for instance, to the future fate of a market at large, these relationships continue to change. So experts themselves, meanwhile, are far from confident that venture exchanges will survive in their current forms. They don't actually believe in the future of venture capitalism in the same way that the Canadian government does. The companies that do succeed in persisting through the current crisis will not do so by foregrounding the legal foundations of their authority, though, but rather by allowing their analyses to be woven into the speculative fantasies of others. So when I began visiting Mercantile headquarters in 2012, rare earth ore prices had fallen into precipitous decline. It had been bold for the company to fund an exploration program while other companies were going into hibernation, Jack admitted. Still, he hoped that the dearth of industry activity that summer would mean less competition for the attention of investors. It seemed like a good ploy. In other years, a glowing field report might have captivated industry blogs and significantly boosted Mercantile's trading volume and stock price. 2 years earlier, Mercantile stock had sold for more than $10 a share, which is huge for this industry. Weeks after the 2013 field report was posted online, though, the same stock had barely moved from its months-long hold at about 15 cents. Even as other rare earths juniors were ceding their claims and dissolving, Mercantile geologists kept insisting that they could prove up the Nunavut project and sell it to a major producer. They simply needed more time. So the ethical significance of the information that these experts produced during the proving up process, they might have complained, was also a moving target. In a really good, incisive study of exploration finance regulations in Canada, political geographer Neil Marjorie shows how, quote, the practical significance of disclosure as a regulatory technique has been reframed in terms of, firstly, the well-being of Ontario's resource economy, because everything started in Eastern Canada, Then, wider processes of Canadian industrialization. And finally, promoting Canadian knowledge industries within the global economy. Within each shift in interpretive practice, Marjorie argues, attempted to codify and shape the circulation of information deemed by regulators as material to the valuation of shares. Right? So what these regulatory promises mean has changed depending upon the industrial prerogatives at a given time. All right? With each shift, the experts who authored this material information found themselves responsible for securing a broader array of concerns. So the way in which they served as a moral agent was also changing, right? But despite the scale and technical diversity of these roles, the persistent association between Canadian venture exchanges and fraud has made it difficult for policymakers and social scientists alike to discuss the regulation of language in markets without treating narrativization as deliberate deception. Shortly before the opening of the TSXV, when junior firms were just beginning to solicit stock purchases through then new online investment platforms, anthropologist Anna Singh characterized novice investors' relationships with mineral exploration as a willing capitulation to corporate conjurings, like magicians and stuff, right? Cultivating a sense of possibility around emerging prospects, she argued, required the deliberate production of vagueness by exploration company personnel, both in terms of geotechnical data as well as geographical setting. And the subsequent evolution of regulatory forms in Canada suggests that, just like I half joked about Chapin and Schaffer, regulators read Anna Singh and said, well, we can't have this anymore. We need to take what she's doing seriously. No more conjuring. But people want conjuring. So as mercantile staff understood well before the rarest exploration firms began to collapse, the kinds of literary technologies that have been useful for conjuring spectacles of adventure and wealth, they function very differently from the kinds of literary technologies required for regaining trust. In 1997, BREEx, a Canadian-owned company that purported to be exploring for gold in Indonesia, collapsed amidst revelations that the spectacular yields projected for its Busan project were the result of fraudulent sample analyses. Investors lost $6 billion. Just to be clear, again, this seems like I'm talking about one company. This is almost analogous to the subprime mortgage housing scandal / collapse in 2008 in terms of its effect on the overall Canadian financial markets. So it affected everything. For months, industry journalists ruminated on other famous frauds that had rattled Canadian exchanges, while foreboding that other new, highly touted prospects could be the next BREEx. Within a year, hundreds of exploration companies completely unaffiliated with BREEx lost their funding and dissolved. In 1999, the Canadian Securities Administrators responded to the collapse of the exploration industry by instituting new regulatory measures collectively known as National Instrument 43101, a classification scheme for publicizing prospects and listing exploration companies on the TSXV and other Canadian exchanges. The resulting regulatory regime affected thousands of internationally dispersed companies. Again, even if they're not based in Canada and they don't mine in Canada, they're still listed on Canadian exchanges because that's where the investment activity happens. Right? So the resulting regime, the instrument as it came to be known throughout Canada, standardized forms for public filings and research reports and defined formal categories of investors based on their prior experience with venture markets. Speaking with accredited investors, company officials could speculate openly about the future of specific exploration sites and narrativize personal hopes regarding their development. For the many prospective investors who failed to meet these criteria, what we call retail investors, promoters and geologists were legally bound to engage with them using only very carefully regulated text and speech. Experts were required to explain that imprecise estimations, market changes, or new regulations might delay the development of a prospect suddenly and indefinitely. Ostensibly, the instrument was designed primarily to assign liability for inaccurate or fraudulent technical analyses by locating responsibility for the accuracy of each reported figure with a single qualified person. There needs to be a space that can be filled by a signature on these reports. But as Eleanor Riley put it, many geologists quickly learned to treat the instrument as little more than the promise of a paper trail, a chain of reports which could be used to link specific numbers back to individual certified experts in the event that a scandal emerged. By standardizing the terms and formats for field reports and other research documents, however, the instrument also recognized, or reconfigured rather, the authorial voice of individual geologists, who, as Eleanor lamented, had previously been able to structure the reports as longer narratives suffused with reflections. When I began conducting fieldwork in Vancouver in 2012, mercantile employees had been working with the instrument for over a decade. For most of the young investor relations staff, the regulations had been in place for their entire careers. Some seem to, as Eleanor put it, almost get uneasy reading the older reports. She offered half-jokingly, since they had grown so accustomed to seeing reflective language just carefully edited out of anything they wrote. As mercantile staff began navigating an abrupt market downturn in 2012, though, this instrument-mandated labor often left staff struggling to discern what kinds of assurances their audiences actually desired. Eventually, I came to experience the emotional buildup preceding each new press release and the letdown as each one continually fails to impact the company's stock price. Each subsequent press release brought new anxieties too, particularly after dozens of competing exploration projects and other rare earths companies began folding in 2013. Initially, and this is just some of these companies, I perceived the sarcasm and sudden shifts in tone during these periods as evidence that my interlocutors had grown cynical towards what anthropologist Annalise Riles describes as the aesthetics of complexity, coloring the post-instrument regulatory environment, right? But they just didn't believe this stuff anymore. Few exploration industry professionals, they admitted, helped their companies grow simply by insisting on their status as experts and promoting their work solely through technical reports. In order to satisfy their audience's appetites for both serious projects and good stories, though, mercantile staff became deft at emphasizing the emergent and uncertain nature of rare earth-based materials uses, processing technologies, and mineralogy. But as Jack and others developed strategies for displacing the burdens of authorship away from their own documents into other unregulated spaces of discussion, though, it kind of became less clear what kinds of meaning their knowledge and labor could hold for investors, whether or not their company survived. And this is another quote. "You'll learn the language around here pretty soon," end quote. An executive from a rival rare earths exploration company told me shortly after my arrival in Vancouver, quote, "You'll be able to figure out the difference between a project and a real project," end quote. Prospects explored by Mercantile Minerals, he begrudgingly admitted, were always real projects. One of over 1,500 junior exploration companies in downtown Vancouver, and that's on all commodities, not just on rare earths, Mercantile was known throughout the city for maximizing its control of its exploration claims by attempting to hold on to them all the way through to production. Struggling to explain the company's ethos to me during my first week in the office, a younger Mercantile staff member cited the influence of technical staff on the company's board of directors. Quote, "Geologists hate killing projects," he said, "because you just don't know," end quote. As the industry became dominated by small companies flipping claims after minimal analytical work, or as the same person put it, two guys in a rented room with a computer and a phone, basically, Mercantile's patient development strategy was growing rarer. Real projects, the executive might have added, accrued material residues that could both help and hinder exploration experts' promotional labor. At Mercantile, I spent 2 months in the company's map room, helping staff update project maps and formatting technical diagrams. Really exciting ethnographic work. Separated by a glass wall from the cubicles where investor relations staff spent their morning hours phoning investors, and the hallways leading to Mercantile executives' harbor-facing offices, the large cluttered map room, this was a particularly clean day, the large cluttered map room resembled the office of an aged geology professor. Boxes of core samples sat atop filing cabinets filled with technical reports. Periodically, Eleanor reflected, she and her colleagues would invite prospective partnering firms, including a major car battery manufacturer during my months working in the office, to visit company headquarters, where Mercantile executives made a point to let guests linger in the map room. The artifacts that Mercantile's geologists had accumulated during years of work at the Nunavut prospect conveyed the company's commitment to seeing things through, Eleanor insisted. To some shareholders, though, that sense of commitment also signified indecision, she admitted, quote, "Like the company can't see when it's time to move on," end quote. Elsewhere in Vancouver, Mercantile staff members' seriousness made them targets of ridicule. This is like a much more normal-looking exploration office. Days after the company released its 2013 exploration field report, a rival executive whom I frequently met for lunch mocked the way he assumed that the staff had prepared for the report's publication. Quote, "Valuable shareholders need to be soft-sold with a little more mystery," he complained. Quote, "Those guys at Mercantile spend so much time talking about a news release before it comes out that they drive down their stock price by eliminating the surprise." End quote. As conversations I observed around the office made plain, though, Mercantile staff were wary of overburdening their audiences with technical data. Like they know this. My first day in the office, I witnessed a senior staff member help a new person unwind this compulsion after an unsolicited phone call went on for too long. Quote, "Try not to give people so much information over the phone," he had gently admonished. quote, you have to get them to want to ask more questions, unquote. So promoters and geologists throughout Vancouver frequently mention shareholders' apparent inattention to detail while reflecting on the woes of the TSX fee. Even though rigorously checked technical data was more widely available than ever before, this same executive insisted, quote, people still wanted to buy some mystery. Mercantile staff and the rival executive offered nearly identical distinctions in their portraits of the serious investor and the poorly educated non-specialist that they imagined had been brought into high-risk mineral exploration ventures trading through sensational news coverage, fantastic rumors, and the emergence of online investment tools. The rival executive was more explicit, though. Quote, these kinds of people hear about a few companies making money, and they start thinking that penny stocks, which is what this whole sphere of investment is called, penny stocks. They start thinking that penny stocks are a sure thing. They need to be told over and over that they might lose all their money. End quote. Reflecting on Mercantile's stagnation, he took on a foreboding tone. Quote, a stock trading at 15 cents hasn't necessarily found its floor yet. It can always go lower, always, end quote. So the ways that exploration experts across Vancouver reflected on the impatience and skepticism that they perceived among shareholders underscore how thoroughly experts' own fears of market collapse inflected their everyday communication practices. The junior mercantile staff were trained to see their performances of seriousness as rife with potential liabilities for the company, though, also contrast with how technoscientific literary technologies are typically presented as securing knowledge and trust. The experimental reports undergirding the gentlemanly sociality of early modern natural philosophers, Stephen Chapin argues, function by convincing witnesses that they and the experimentalists who set experiments into motion had observed precisely the same details that the experimentalists had instructed them to notice. We see the same things, right? In order for Mercantile's exploration field reports and other technical documents to secure the trust of potential investors, though, the authors had to defer to the speculative musings of non-experts and essentially enable them to think that they see things that other people don't. The effort that Mercantile staff expended in humoring investors' storytelling whims, even as they carefully restrained many narrative urges of their own, often caused conversations within the office to become saturated with weary humor. I often heard employees cackle while perusing the LinkedIn Rare Earth Elements forum, usually after they had spent many hours on the phone. Shouting jokes from their desks, they directed each other to interesting links, even as they mocked the more implausible posts that emerged every few days. My first week, a technology blogger posted rumors of plans for sending rare earths mining robots to the moon, which is something that might happen in several decades, but it's not going to happen next year. By my second month, I had seen enough similar posts to chuckle myself when a group member laconically asked the forum, is it that time of year when we talk about rare earths mining on the seabed again? So respected geologists and promoters, Eleanor and Jack might have observed, understood the instrument's rules, but they also knew how to take jokes. The time I spent copy editing field reports, preliminary economic assessment updates, and press releases offered daily reminders that Mercantile staff could make only certain kinds of promises about the futures of the projects. The conversations that they shared online, the conversations that they observed online, betrayed few inhibitions about discussing the future of rare earths dependent technologies, or their mineral exploration as a whole. Group forums provided a bridge between the formal genres of instrument-regulated discourse and the informal domains where unconventional interpretations, rumors, and more general and occasionally fanciful aspects of rare earth knowledge can be articulated and shared. But as discussion posts cited instrument-generated technical documents and drew their numbers into unruly comparisons, the authors of these documents continually found their status as moral agents, the very status that served as the foundation of the instrument, thrown into confusion and doubt. Now, it's worth pointing out that this paradox lands very differently for folks depending on their age and experience. The young men on Mercantile's investor relations staff, they're always men, often lapsed into cynicism while complaining about the dismal state of the company's stock price. Senior members, though, assured me that similar divergences between emergent projects' apparent feasibility and stock price routinely occurred whenever prices for idiosyncratic commodities rapidly rose and declined. Quote, serious projects, Eleanor lamented, sometimes just get lost in the shuffle, unquote. Eleanor and Jack insisted that the disorganized valuation of disparate rare earths projects was at least partly related to investors' lack of technical knowledge concerning rare earths mineralogy and materials. Again, this is a pedagogical space as well. In 2011, getting ahead of myself here. Yeah. Jack began soliciting geologists through the industry to offer tutorials on the LinkedIn forum. Lessons ranged from the differences in technological applications for light versus heavy rare earth elements, to battery and wind turbine design, to narrative comparisons of geographical settings. Lots of different, very dry things. Jack himself often initiated tutorials and invited forum participants to elaborate upon his explanations. Geologists and other experts working for universities and government research institutions frequently joined in, bridging their explanations with links to news articles and reflections on experience from the field. When I first asked Jack about the motivations behind the tutorials, he equated a prospector's idiom for an unexplored site with investor relations ready narrative tools. Oh, there's that slide. Quote, a blank slate may wind up being a good prospect, but a more developed prospect gives you better stories to work with, end quote. Armed with a few simple tools of analysis, forum participants proposed provocative equivalences, free associating between rumors of ore grades attached to superficially explored sites and the painstakingly audited estimates derived from projects years in the making. Yet by tacitly encouraging LinkedIn users to speculate about the possible futures of other rare earths projects, Jack's comments suggested, mercantile staff were also helping to ensure that investors would eventually return to serious projects like their Nunavut prospect once they had learned enough to be skeptical of other companies' technical boasts. Except, of course, when prospective investors failed to return. Despite Jack's earnest efforts to promote his LinkedIn tutorials as tools for helping investors engage with serious projects, forum participants were often far less enamored of Mercantile's technical assessments than of the fabulous comparisons that the company's literary technologies enabled. Several years after I first visited Mercantile's office, Jack posted a brief YouTube video depicting a new continuous hydrochloric acid leach ore processing technology that was then being developed at Mercantile's prototype processing center in Quebec. While Jack's original post generated little immediate discussion within the forum, by December of that year, other group posts discussing acid leach-based technologies had begun linking back to the Mercantile video. A few posts also linked to other emergent prospects, proclaiming wildly impressive efficiency numbers for acid leach processes at these other sites without presenting any technical documentation. I emailed Jack to gather his thoughts on what I assumed were private companies, which are groups that are not trading on the TSXV and are thus not beholden to instrument-specified disclosure requirements. Private companies attempting to make their prospects look legitimate by association. As he put it, this kind of thing happens all the time, he wrote back. Trying to fight it would only make it work. Serious investors know bullshit when they see it, end quote. Or so he hoped. When I emailed other Mercantile staff for the reactions to the posts, they were less dismissive. Quote, we got a bunch of calls after those videos came out, one person admitted. At first we wanted to laugh, but it was good to have new people asking questions about the project again. Very depressed tone of voice. Some admitted that they were wary about undermining, let alone mocking, anyone's questions, particularly during slow news periods between releases of exploration field reports. Parrying questions with far-ranging industry gossip as they deftly pointed prospective investors towards online references to Mercantile documents, they offered instead both the promise of steady work and the allure of a still emerging technological space. For a class of minerals where so much remained unknown, they insisted, any new development might boost the value of the company's Nunavut prospect. Whether or not the company's shareholders would trust them enough to be patient for the project to unfold, though, most Mercantile staff were reluctant to guess. So, as I've tried to show throughout my talk, serious numbers and speculative narratives tend to circulate in linked and overlapping ways. As individual experts have worked to mediate these flows, though, they've learned that securing investors' attention while following the law leaves little time for establishing other forms of epistemic authority. Yet the radical divergence between the many literary technologies that occupy experts' day-to-day work, from the staid and formally regulated documents like exploration field reports and economic assessments, to the unruly realm of LinkedIn discussions and YouTube comments, has done more than increase these experts' professional anxieties or unsettle the prices of their stocks. That individual experts remain legally responsible for eliding these contradictory pressures and for keeping the moral economy of the disclosure system intact underscores regulators' continuing refusal to acknowledge the dramatic risks and dark desires that keep venture capitalism in motion. Contemporary mineral exploration experts might disagree that collective faith in certified bodies of knowledge is possible to any large degree, let alone sufficient to resolve collective crises. The increasingly complex work of mediating between claims to knowledge and assertions of legitimacy within venture capital markets, though, makes clear that experts' communication practices, both those forms of writing, speech, and calculation that count as regulated disclosures, and the many other forms that take shape around speculative narratives, nevertheless enact fundamental functions of liberal governance. Annalise Riles, again, observes a similarly pragmatic force effected through practices as mundane as filling out securities transfer receipts. As she puts it, an ethnographic approach to financial markets requires coming to terms with the market as a realm of explicit politics, of compulsion, of must, shall, will, of purposeful government of self and others, end quote. Laura Baer, again, finds equally consequential effects amidst mere acts of differentiation, acts that exploration experts must continually perform while engaging with prospective investors, perhaps dozens of times each day. As she puts it very elegantly, to identify an activity as speculation has long been to take a moral position on economic reform. So these ostensibly demoralized, I guess they're actually quite obviously demoralized experts are making these kinds of moral positions known day by day in their work because they are legally bound to. But as exploration experts increasingly demur from criticizing investors' fantastical narratives, even as they assume ever greater degrees of personal liability, the technical positions from which reform might be articulated are becoming more difficult to find. So mineral exploration finance is increasingly shaped by gestures of deferral, from the legal liabilities and boundary work that regulators defer to individual experts, to the expectations of progress and profit the exploration experts ask shareholders to defer in turn. Together, these deferrals are undermining Canadian policymakers' efforts to present venture finance as a value-producing activity upon which other forms of commerce can't depend. Throughout the months I spent visiting Mercantile's office, the 2013 field report for the Nunavut prospect failed to bring new investors to the company. Eleanor frankly admitted that her own standing as a respected rare earths geologist and Mercantile's standing within Vancouver as a serious company would not be enough to keep the project in operation of the TSXV continued its general decline. And this is a very general decline. As I speak now, 9 years later, the company remains open, but the relevance of Eleanor's forebodings have only grown. By 2016, the index for the exchange had fallen below 500 points, its lowest level since the Ventures Exchange was created in 1999. By 2021, 1/3 of its listed companies and nearly half of its total market value had disappeared, particularly for young exploration experts who began their careers after the introduction of the instrument. The trust gap, bemoaned by senior colleagues, is no longer an exceptional crisis, but rather a permanent backdrop for day-to-day work. Reflecting on the manner in which contemporary narratives of crisis can trouble distinctions between context and critique in anthropological research, Janet Reutemann suggests that social scientists and their interlocutors negotiate similar pressures while mediating and instrumentalizing competing claims to knowledge. The point is to observe crisis as a blind spot, she argues, and hence to apprehend the ways in which it regulates narrative constructions, the way in which it allows certain questions to be asked while others are foreclosed. Indeed, Mercantile staff were painfully aware that the ways that they discussed the crisis facing the TSXV in conversations with prospective investors would continue to shape the crisis itself. The reluctance to publicly lampoon the ridiculous arguments and associations they encountered online reflected their awareness that the trust gap was not something they could confront head on. Before Jack began hosting LinkedIn tutorials, Eleanor had championed the company's in-house geological expertise as the asset that had enabled them to weather the downturn that followed the 2008 financial crisis, which hit Vancouver quite hard. Fewer Vancouver-based juniors kept PhD geologists on staff, she reminded me, particularly as technical contractors had proliferated around the province. Since then, she and other Mercantile executives had remained adamant about the need to keep credentialed scientists in the office, even if only to preemptively stifle random accusations of fraud. As Jack solemnly offered, quote, "Bre-X is still the elephant in the room," end quote. For exploration experts, reflexive modes of relating to crisis affect their labor at multiple scales. To ameliorate the sense of crisis surrounding venture capital markets and convince shareholders to be patient as prospects develop, geologists and promoters must occasionally encourage their audiences to ask questions that cannot be immediately answered. How large future markets for specific rare earths commodities might grow, or perhaps what kinds of processing techniques might emerge to make use of idiosyncratic mineral complexes whose ores are not yet economical to mine. Yet exploration experts' ambivalent engagement, tongue twister, with diverse literary technologies also belies a much broader sense of responsibility. Certain deployments of numbers and narratives, Mercantile staff know, could also helpfully amplify specific senses of crisis, concerning the predictability of global mineral supply chains, for instance, in ways that could cast the mineral exploration as a whole in a different light. 2 years before I arrived in Vancouver, the CEO of Mercantile Minerals had bolstered the profile of the company's exploration work in Quebec by convincing American legislators to audit manufacturing supply chains for minerals sourced in certain countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The resulting legislation, a section of the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act of 2010, helped to bring the term conflict minerals into everyday use throughout North America. In addition to casting the search for domestic rare earth sources as a national and moral imperative, the terminology also helped to obviate the sense of crisis pervading the TSXV by conjuring future markets for rare earth ores. The geopolitical constraints that would produce these new markets would transcend periodic cycles of investor confidence and suspicion, industry officials suggested, and would eventually outlive any particular exchange. So working amidst a sense of perpetual crisis, Reutemann's analysis suggests, can cause experts to conceptualize their work primarily in terms of prohibited ideas and narrative avenues foreclosed. Yet by subtly displacing attention from their technical reports to their tacit encouragement of speculative comparisons, Jack and other mercantile staff have worked to present the crisis facing venture exchanges not as a blind spot, but as an aporia. A collapsing bubble can bring out great opportunities for the folks who stick around, Jack insisted once, as we left the office together after a particularly long day. In the meantime, persuading investors to be patient has meant ceding space to other voices and enabling new mixtures of signal and noise. Over time, mercantile staff hope the instrument-generated paper trail will eventually serve a new purpose, proving to skeptical investors that their trust had been warranted and the experts had been right all along. Thanks.